If you would, go ahead and take out your Bible and turn to John chapter 4, and we will almost entirely be in John chapter, but we'll be there for a minute or two, and then we'll stop, and we'll go back to it. So if you've got a bookmark or a bulletin or something to slide in there, that way if you close it, you won't forget it. We'll be right back there to it. While you're doing that, I want you to think about, have you ever been in a situation that could happen unless certain circumstances brought you there? I'm going to tell you this evening, before we get into our lesson, about, that's some feedback on that, I think, about two situations that brought me into contact with Hall of Fame baseball players. In the early 1990s, we were in Toronto, Canada. Me and Mom and Dad and my sister. And this was, I believe, in the midst of Toronto winning a World Series because they won 2 in a row. And so they had won one, and they would win one the next year as well. Well, when a team is really good, it's hard to get tickets. It's a little different today because there are so many websites that you can buy tickets on. But back then, you went to the window, and if they didn't have it, you went to the person standing beside the window. Well, we go to buy tickets from a man, and after we bought the tickets, we're walking back to the car or the hotel or what it was, but we round the corner, and the Minnesota Twins baseball team is coming right at us from the opposite direction. Some of you may know or remember the name Kirby Puckett, who played for years with Minnesota. Kind of a short and heavy set. Didn't look like a baseball player, but was one of the best there was. He was walking in front of the group. Well, there's no way we would have seen those guys on the sidewalk right in front of us had we not been at that spot trying to buy tickets. That's how it worked. A few years later, we were in Delaware, I believe, and we were on our way to Philadelphia. Me and Mom and Dad and my sister. And we stay all night at a hotel on a Sunday evening in the middle of the summer. And as we go to check out of the hotel, there was another man who was checking out of the hotel as well. His name was Robin Yount, Hall of Fame baseball player, played for the Milwaukee Brewers. Not only was he a Hall of Fame baseball player, he had been a Hall of Fame baseball player for about 12 hours. He had been inducted into the Hall of Fame in New York on that Sunday afternoon, and he and his wife and their 3 kids were driving from New York to Washington, D.C. to go on a family vacation to the nation's capital. Now, had I not stayed in that same hotel and they not stayed in the same hotel, you'd have never crossed paths. Now, I'm pretty sure that if you were to ask Kirby Puckett if he remembers the 12-year-old kid and his dad that they passed against in the he's dead now anyway, but he wouldn't have remembered that anyway. And I doubt Robin Yount remembers talking to Dad and us in the checkout line, I guess it were, at the hotel. But the point is, sometimes circumstances bring us into things that can make some changes. If you were to ask me, how many major Hall of Fame baseball players have you met? Well, my number's probably bigger than yours and probably bigger than a lot of people, but not by anything that I did on purpose. It just happened to be that way. We've spent a lot of time on Wednesday nights talking about miracles. And in those miracle lessons, a lot of times what we've talked about are people that just sort of passed Jesus, as it were. Think about all of those miracle lessons, and then how many of those people do we know the name of them? It's pretty rare, right? Sometimes there's a specific name, but sometimes it's a woman or a man, a person who was demon-possessed, a person from the other side of the sea. Very generic names, but those people came in contact with Jesus. Tonight, we're going to talk about the woman at the well. I suspect a lesson that we're familiar with. I've tried to do ever so often here a lesson that involves or that is about a woman within the Bible. You may remember last month we talked about Sarah and Hagar. Well, tonight we're going to talk about the woman at the well. Notice that there is no name given, rather just the woman. We do not have a name right here, but that's all right. So I purposefully only had a very short section of the scripture read tonight. Jimmy, I thought about you. You know, last couple times you've had to read, it's been, we took a half time and then you read the second half of it afterwards. It's been kind of long. I thought we'll go with a shorter one this evening. But it sets the circumstances for our story. So if you're in John chapter 4, you can look at verses 3 through 6 that we looked at, that Jimmy read just a moment ago. But a couple of points from it. Jesus was heading north from Galilee, or north to Galilee from Judea. And Samaria fell between Galilee and Judea. And so you either had to go through Samaria or you had to head east to avoid it. We can relate to this, right? We all know that there's a quickest way to get from point A to point B. But sometimes if there's traffic or a wreck or something like that, we also know that there's that second way that we can get to our house. Usually that second way to get to our house is a little longer, right? It might require a few more stop signs, or we might have to turn on a couple of different roads, but sometimes that comes in handy if need be. Well, why might they choose to go a different way? Well, we're going to talk about that tonight. This conflict that sort of existed between Samaritans and Jews is part of the reason where this, part of the basis of where this story comes from. Now, the exact location of where this takes place is near Mount Gerizim, the place John refers to as Jacob's well. And Jesus is there at that well, and that is where our story will take place. Now, it's a quiet scene, but that was about to change. I want you to turn to John 4 and look at verses 7, 8, and 9. Read along with me. Like I said, we're going to read through much of John 4 here as we go. 7, 8, and 9. A woman of Samaria came to draw water. And Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Then the woman of Samaria said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman?" And then it says here, for Samaritans have no deal, or for Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. We'll stop there for a second and talk about that just a bit. Jesus is there quietly resting, right? He's sitting by the well. We can sort of read into this that it's been a long day. The disciples have went to go get food, and a woman of Samaria comes in to draw water. And Jesus, we would sometimes say asks her, but the reading here almost kind of tells her to draw him or to get him a drink. And so this woman questions why he, a Jew, was asking a Samaritan woman for a drink, since the Jews and Samaritans had no dealings with each other. Now, this is a limited interaction that has already established the difference between the two groups of people. For one, she is clearly recognizing Jesus almost from the get-go as a Jewish person. She does not know Jesus in the sense that we know what Jesus was, but she knows that he was a Jewish person. Whatever gave him away, his language, his accent, his dress, whatever it might would have been, there was a clear difference. And she, having been raised in this Samaritan town, having been raised around Samaritans, had been raised in a situation where one would say, I don't hang out with these people, right? There's a difference between the two. We'll look at that a little bit here in just a second. But they were different from the Jewish people. The Samaritans were. Most Samaritans lived in Samaria. And for hundreds of years, they had been enemies. And they didn't agree mostly about worship and where God had them to worship. The simplest thing, we could go much deeper, but the simplest thing here is that the Jews worshiped in the temple in Jerusalem. And the Samaritans worshiped on the mountain, in Mount Gerizim. Okay, and so there's this difference in we should worship here. No, we should worship there. Okay, now this is a religious conflict at its basis. But we've just said that they've disagreed with each other for hundreds of years by this point. Sometimes disagreements that last for a long period of time, we sort of look back and we think, I don't really remember what we're disagreeing about. Odds are, had you went to most Samaritans and asked them, why do we not like the Jews? you would have got a wide variety of answers. Some people probably would have said, because they worship there and we worship here. But some people probably said, I don't know, language. They look different. They live over there. Sort of generic. I don't know why we don't like them, but we don't like them. And if you'd asked the Jews, they probably could have come up with an answer that said, well, they should be worshiping them in the temple, but everybody wouldn't have said that. Some of them probably would have said the same thing. They're from out there. You know how those people, all those kind of things. And so this sort of disagreement emerges over time. Do those things exist today? Conflicts that have existed for a long period, but people couldn't tell you what they were. This morning, when Roger was talking about transubstantiation, I would guarantee that the majority of people in this room had never really heard about that, thought about that, or even considered it. I'm going to guess so. And I don't think I'm poking at you by saying that, right? Some of us probably have, some of us probably haven't. That's fine, all right? But that's a disagreement that has led to the death of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And he put it on a slide and talked about it for 2 minutes, and we rolled right on. Well, those conflicts sometimes emerge over time, and it causes people to be conflicting with each other. Let's go a little further, though. Most Jews wouldn't travel through Samaria, and instead they took the longer route to avoid any contact with Samaritans. Think about that for a second. You've probably done that too. You have somebody that you didn't want to drive by their house, so you went the long way, so they didn't see you, all right? Saw you drive by the house. No, you didn't. You hit it. I'm going to go this way, all right? They're always being nosy looking, all right? We all can relate to that as well. But they are so in conflict with each other that they wanted to avoid each other completely. But Jesus was no ordinary Jewish person. Let's go back to John chapter 4, and I want to read verses 10 through 15. Remember, he's asked for a drink, and she has asked, why is he asking her? Because they don't really get along. Jesus answered and said to her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. The woman said to him, sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock? Jesus answered and said to her, whoever drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life. The woman said to him, sir, give me this water that I may not thirst nor come here to draw. Now we'll stop there for just a second because we get a little bit more in depth into the story. Why has this woman come to the well? Well, it's a simple question, right? She has come to the well because she needs water for her household. You can think of all the things that we use water for today. They would have used water for the same thing back then. They would have used water to wash their clothing, to wash themselves, to wash their utensils. Whatever water would have been used then would have been used now would have been used then. They needed water to drink. They needed water for their animals. This well would have been an important gathering place. Now, when people came together, talking about water probably would have been something they talked about quite a bit. Tonight, I was talking with somebody about how it's going to be a lot warmer this coming week, right? Why do we talk about that? How many of you have talked about weather with people today? We do this all the time, right? Because when we're just sort of here, wherever here might be, that's a general topic that we'll talk about. So you can imagine what would have been discussed at that well. Boy, I wish the well was closer to my house. Yeah, but then all those people would be there too. You have those conversations, right? You would have had this kind of thing. Jesus tells her, he says, if you knew the gift of God, you would have asked him for water, and he would have given you living water. This living water, we read, can remove thirst. And she wants this water here as well. I don't know yet if she totally understands what Jesus is saying, but it would be nice to never have to go to the well again. And I would imagine a woman who uses water for all the things that it would be nice to never have to go do that again if we're thinking about it in a literal sense. And so Jesus says what he says, and she wants this as well. But Jesus then moves the situation along just a little bit. I want you to look at verses 16 through 18. Jesus said to her, he said, "Go, call your husband and come here." And the woman answered and said, "I have no husband." And Jesus said to her, "You have well said, I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. In that you spoke truly." Now, that's a sermon all into itself. And I don't want to talk about that a ton right now because we can go into a lot of different things right there. But the point of this is to be aware that Jesus recognized that this woman had sin in her life. This woman had done wrong, or whatever language we want to use for 2,000 years ago. When Jesus tells her this, then she comes to assume that he was a prophet. He's knowledgeable about a whole lot of different things. We have moved one step beyond the normal gather around the well conversations. I would imagine that men and husbands had been talked about around that well a lot over the years, right? They'd probably talked about how they aggravated with their husband. He won't do this or that, all those kind of gossipy conversations. But this man, Jesus, has sort of pointed out a little something else, right? This is not something that seemed to be extremely well known. And so now the person who was talking about living water and I won't be thirsty anymore is now pointing out things in my life that doesn't seem like a whole lot of people know. There is a difference. There we've seen something change in the conversation. Let's go forward just a little bit more. Jesus is more important than where to worship. Let's look at John chapter 4, verses 20 through 24. The woman said, verse 19, she said, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet." That's where we stopped a minute ago. "Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth." Let's stop there for just a second. Her question puts Samaritans and Jews once again at odds over where to worship. This conversation, like we said, might look familiar to us. We're not Samaritans or Jews, but sometimes we have those disagreements that go back far and farther and farther. Sometimes we want to get maybe better than, but this old conversation has sprung up again. Now remember, Jesus has talked about living water and all this, and she says, "Well, wait a minute though. We say you should worship on this mountain, and you say that you should worship in Jerusalem." And Jesus kind of slides a little line in there. If you notice it in verse 21, I think he says, "Well, you should worship in Jerusalem." But he said it's coming pretty soon that's not going to matter anymore. Those kind of things that we're conflicting over, those little small things aren't going to matter. Jesus doesn't necessarily declare either as right, but he talks more about the heart and the attitude. Would you agree with that statement? The reduced form of the gospel right here. What Jesus really says right here. That he says too often our arguments become these sort of esoteric or minute, sort of simple. And Jesus says, wait a minute. What's the last thing he says? We should worship in what 2 ways? Spirit and truth, right? He mentions those. Jesus didn't talk about a mountain or a temple. He mentions those, but he said that the day's coming when that's not going to matter. We need to look at spirit and truth. But how many religious arguments, even today, focus on the mountain and focus on the temple and aren't as concerned with the spirit and the truth? We should be going forward at all times, but a lot of our religious arguments have us turn around looking in the past. Are there any examples in the Bible of people turning around and looking back where things turn out right? And it's usually wrong, right? It's usually more of a go forward, progress to the next stop. Jesus left her with worship in spirit and in truth. Colossians chapter 3 and 17. You've heard this before, right? "Whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him." That is a primary spot of focus. A change had come at this point. Something changes here in this conversation. We're going to look at two sets of verses here. Let's look at 25 through 30 to start with, and then I'm going to skip down after that. 25. The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. This conversation that she's had, you see some change in her from the get-go, right? There's a Jew-Samaritan conflict, which turns into this man seems to know a lot about me. He might be a prophet, to, I know a Messiah is coming. That's where she's at. Jesus said to her in verse 26, I who speak to you am he. Now, at this point, his disciples came, and they marveled that he talked with a woman, yet no one said, what do you seek, or why are you talking with her? The woman then left her water pot, went her way into the city, and said to the men, come see a man who told me all things that I ever did. Could this be the Christ? Then they went out of the city and came to him. Now, we'll skip down here in just a second, but we can see here this conversation that they've had. So she goes back into town, leaves the water pot, right? Like, well, the whole purpose of coming was to bring the water. She's forgot all about the water right now. She goes in to the men in the city. That's probably the religious leaders right there. She goes into them. She says, wait a minute. This guy seems to know a whole lot. Is this who we've been looking for? Let's skip down to 39. And many of the Samaritans of that city believed in him because of the word of the woman who testified. He told me all that I ever did. So when the Samaritans had come to him, they urged him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. And many more believed because of his own word. Then they said to the woman, now we believe, not because of what you said, for we ourselves have heard him, and we know that this is indeed the Christ, the Savior of the world. The woman was convinced that a Messiah was coming. Didn't know the date, didn't know who or what, but she was convinced. Jesus clarifies to her in this conversation. He says, what's it say there in verse 26? I who speak to you am he. Now think about that for a second. I who speak to you am he. In 1999, I knew that Robin Yount had been inducted into the Hall of Fame that previous day. And I knew what he looked like because I probably had his baseball card and had seen him on TV. But when you round the corner in a hotel and you see a Major League Baseball player standing there, dressed exactly like your dad or whoever, you think, whoa, that's him. And I remember telling Dad, I was like, that's Robin Yount. It all kind of clicked there, right? There's no chance that when we left room 224 that we thought we was going to see a Hall of Famer when we got down to the front. But sometimes you see something, it's like, whoa, wait a minute. And then we talked to him, and it was like, oh, this definitely is a Hall of Fame baseball player. Can you see that story playing itself out with the woman here? Can you see the same thing? I'm just going to get water. Here's a guy that seems to know a whole lot about me. It is I who am that Messiah that you know is coming. Her life changed a great bit in about, what, an hour? That's a big change that happened for her. When the disciples return, a woman leaves without a pot. She goes into the town, right? And she goes into the town. She tells him, she says, he has told me everything that I have ever did. And the Samaritans, and notice this, the Samaritans asked Jesus, a Jew, to stay with them. And it says that he stays for a couple of days. Just like that, a conflict that has existed for hundreds of years, people that didn't like each other, didn't want to be with each other, did not have any use for each other, are now inviting each other to stay for a couple of days, and they teach. And then later it says it wasn't what the woman said, because I'm sure she went back and told some people. She talked about what Jesus said, but they said, we learned it. Let's use a term we're familiar with. We got it straight from the horse's mouth, right? Jesus told us right there. He sort of bridges that gap between two groups of people that had been wide for a long time. Let's think about the last bits right here. Jesus alone is the living water that fills our void. I would imagine that this woman had to go back to the well the next day. I would imagine that there were times when this woman was washing clothes later on in her life that she probably thought, boy, I wish that water, I wish they had to go back and get this water, right? Probably had that thought in her head. But they realized that that's not what they were talking about when it came to living water, right? What Jesus offered was an opportunity for eternity. We can see here, Jesus is not fazed by our sin, right? This woman, and we didn't talk a whole lot about it, but this woman had been called out for her sin. And Jesus could have looked at her and said, well, first of all, you're a Samaritan and we don't talk to you. And second of all, you're a sinner, and the apostles and disciples fussed at him about Pharisees. They all fussed at him about talking to sinners. He could have said, I don't need to talk to you. But that's not what he did, right? At what point here does he condemn her in like a harsh tone? Maybe depending on how you read that one verse, he says, I know you've had 5 husbands, but that's not a cutoff of the conversation, right? Jesus continues to discuss and talk with her. And the last one right there, he starts it with the conversation, right? Starts it with the conversation. Not an immediate conversion, not a start right out of the bat conviction of her, but he starts with a conversation. Do you think that Jesus asking her for water put them on a level ground that they had never really been on before? She says that. How is it that you, a Jew, are talking to me, a Samaritan? She was surprised by that. She's on the back foot just a little bit, but now they're having a conversation there within. Jesus doesn't immediately go into well, you need to fix this or that. We do that sometimes, don't we? But our best bet would be to go around the well a little bit, chat here and there a little bit, and then build off of that. And you say, well, who am I modeling after if I do it that way? Jesus? It's a pretty good model to follow, right? Tonight, I hope that we've taken and learned a little something from this lesson. And there's a lot of things that we can learn from the woman here at the well. And there's a lot of things that we can learn from how Jesus treats her. But I hope that we'll remember that there are going to be people that we come into contact with that are different than us. But sometimes we let those differences sort of drive us away from them rather than drive us a little closer to them. And our goal, and we saw that this morning with what Roger presented, our goal is to do what? To preach and teach and to present the gospel to all sorts of people. That's what Jesus did right there. And I hope that we'll remember not necessarily the woman here, but we'll remember the approach that Jesus had as we go forward here as well. If there's anything that we can do for you, whatever it is, we always do invite you to come while we stand and sing.